Hi everyone, Alex here. In this video I'm going to continue to look in depth at the In This Void multi-track session, and this specific video is going to cover the drum parts and the electronic parts of In This Void. So first of all I'm going to start with the drums. As you can see here, and as I mentioned in the previous video, I've color-coded all the drum tracks in gold, just so they're easier to see. So there's actually quite a few drum tracks here. There are 10 active ones in this particular song, and it's more tracks than I usually use. That's because nowadays I quite like to have different tracks for the different kinds of drums that I'm using. So if you can read this over here, it might be quite small. I've got, for example, separate tracks for kick and snare drums. I've got a track for toms, a couple tracks for hi-hats, and so on. So splitting them up into separate tracks really gives me finer control over the effects that I can put on each drum individually. And if there's a specific kit where the kick or the snare is louder than the hi-hats, that makes it really easy to tweak those kind of volumes and get it all evened out. None of the drum parts of In This Void are actually very complicated parts, mainly because I'm not a drummer and I don't profess to know a whole lot about doing intricate drum patterns and loops. So as you can see, most of the parts here, they're quite short and then I've looped them. So for the verses that holds true, the choruses and the bridge, most of the parts are just looped. So I'm just going to break some of the individual kinds of drums down and look at some of those parts individually. So in terms of the kick and snare parts, I'm actually using two different drum kits for those, two different acoustic kits. The first is Logic's Indie Kit Live, and if I just create a loop here I can show you what that sounds like. And the second one is the Studio Heavy Kit. So you can hear they've both kind of inherently got different properties to them. They sound a little bit different. And on both of those I've actually put some reverb just to give them a little bit of presence and make sure they don't feel too upfront in the mix. I'm using multiple kits for the kick and snare parts because in the past I've typically only used one. But actually I quite like the sound that using multiple kits over each other gives. It's kind of like using a brand new kit altogether, and it just makes everything a bit more interesting. Also, I feel like I can get a bit more punch out of the drum parts if I'm using multiple kits that are playing the same part. So at the start of the song here, I've just got a simple kick snare part with some hi-hats as well. So I've got a kick and snare going, some hi-hats on top of that as well. And that's pretty much how the song goes for the entirety of the first verse. It gets a little bit more interesting at the pre-chorus where the kick snare just becomes kicks. And in addition I've actually put an electronic kick part in here as well, just to add a little bit of grit and a little bit of distortion. So without and with. Just adds a little bit more interest to it there. For the chorus I've got a pretty basic kick snare, crash and open hi-hat parts. Nothing really too special going on there. And then as we go into the second verse, it's pretty much the same drum part as the first verse, but for a lot of the second verse I'm actually also playing a tom part as well. That overall just adds to the kind of instrumental density of the second verse, which is also done with electronics, but I'll come to those in a second. Really those toms are just there to give a kind of sense of urgency to the kick and snare part that's already going on. Everything else is kind of fairly standard after that. Apart from I just double up the crash cymbal part in the last chorus. If I just solo those on their own. Just because everything's kind of building up at that point, and it makes it sound a lot more dense and a lot more high energy there. So that briefly is just a kind of overview of what the drum parts are doing in the song. I'm just going to shift gears and look at the electronics now. So at the start of the song I have the same synth as from the first demo, which is, if I just put a loop there, is this synth here. Also there's an electric piano playing as well, which was in the first demo too. So on that first synth there's not really a whole lot effects wise going on. I've just put a sample delay on there, so I'm delaying the left channel by about 900 samples or so, and that really kind of gives the part a kind of stereo spread, and I'm also emphasizing that by panning it slightly off to the right as well. And really, since that part is playing while the verse vocals are going on as well. I didn't want to crowd the vocals out, and I really wanted to give them their own space. So the synth's just kind of sitting at the side there doing its own thing while the vocals are happening. So while that electric piano part is playing during the intro, it then actually cuts out when the vocals come in. Again, that's just to give the vocals a bit more room to work with. And if we move on just to look at the pre-chorus, where that electronic drum kit was there, that synth part here just changes up what it's doing just a little bit to match the rest of the instrumental. Now the chorus actually only has one primary electronic part in there, which is this electric piano here. If I just cut out some of the effects on it real quick, you can hear what it sounds like without anything. So that's quite basic and boring on its own. I chose to add a clip distortion to it, and then a stereo delay. So I think that just adds a lot more interest to that part. And it's a little bit faint in the mix behind the guitars, but it's a nice kind of little backup part that's going on in the chorus there with everything else. Moving on to the second verse, so I've got the same synth as was happening before, you can hear in the background, and I've also added this other lead part, which is actually panned quite far off to the left and has got quite a heavy reverb on it. Again, to give the vocals a lot more room when they come in, just to make that part feel like much more of a background part rather than the main thing you should be focusing on. But it's there, you know, in the background just doing its own thing again. Another difference between the first and the second verses in terms of the electronics, I've got the intro electric piano coming back in again. And that just links back to the beginning of the song and keeps the theme going, if you will. And then as we approach the pre-chorus, all those parts are staying put, but they're doing slightly different things. Feels slightly more urgent and the tension's building up. Again, there's that build up throughout the song. Second chorus, electronics wise, is exactly the same as the first. There's just that electric piano part again. And as we approach the bridge, there's actually no electronic parts in the first part of the bridge. This section here. So that builds up to the guitar solo. As the guitar solo is happening, there's a pretty standard power chords part going on there. It's actually backed up by a synth part here as well. Just to give somewhat more depth to the part there. And finally, going into the last chorus, initially the only electronic part again is that electric piano from the first two choruses. But then, since the last chorus is doubled in length, the second half's where it starts to really get interesting and things really kind of build up to a peak. And that, for one, is because of the electric piano that I linked back in again. So the song's kind of coming full circle. There was this part in the intro, now it's, you know, resurfacing right at the end. And the other thing I've got going, which I've added just for the end, are a couple of string parts. So I've got a staccato part which is panned off to the left, it's got some reverb on it, so it's panned off to the right. I've got a legato section which is panned off to the left and it also has some reverb on it. So this stuff is buried quite far down in the mix, but again it is there in the background to kind of contribute to the whole feeling of all the instruments together. And you can kind of hear it if you're paying attention to it and picking little details out here and there. So that's been a brief look at the drum parts and the electronic parts of In This Void in the context of the multi-track session and seeing how they're mixed in with everything else. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you did in the comments. And stay tuned because next time we're going to be looking at the guitar parts and the vocal parts and seeing how they're mixed in as well. Thanks for watching.